It's not a thing and it's not matter, but it's the only thing and it's the only thing that matters. What is it? Subjective experiences. If you look at the history of the world, it seems to be scaling in concentration of power and in intelligence, but it doesn't scale in compassion. It doesn't scale in wisdom, in actions which lead to better subjective experiences. I was like, no way that is true. No way all of these things are true. And of course, later on, working as an undercover in slaughterhouses, you get to see a whole new perspective. If AI is not sentient, the fact that it reads in the data that humans are saying suffering is bad and happiness is good, it's just like saying humans like red, they don't like green. It's just a piece of data. But if he has subjective experiences, the AI, he can know that suffering is bad. If you look at all the top companies building AI, if you go to their websites, their stated goal is only for humanity. We need a new story. We need to be the stewards.
Hey, Ronen, how are you?
Very good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, great. Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you for the second time, and this time to share it with a wider audience too. So welcome to Sentientism Conversations. And we have the honor of having you as a subscriber already. So you've listened to at least a few of these episodes. So you know this context already. But I think of these conversations as being about some of the deepest and most important questions, and often ones that are neglected. And they're questions of, how do we understand the universe? What's true? What's real? And just as importantly, the questions of ethics, what matters and who matters. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple, pluralistic worldview that I think even a 6-year-old can understand, which says that when we're answering the what's real question, it says we should use a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason and with a healthy dose of humility. And when it comes to the ethical questions, it's quite open-minded about what matters, but it says that every sentient being, at least every being that can feel or experience and care about themselves, should matter seriously in our moral consideration. So I summarize it as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But in these conversations, as you know, I'm talking to a dazzling variety of different interesting minds, and not all of them agree with that worldview. So it'll be really interesting to understand your own philosophical journey and how that underpins what you do now. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself to the audience for people who haven't come across your work yet?
Thanks a lot, Jamie, for this. I would say I'm a social entrepreneur who's focused on enhancing the community and using storytelling to promote reason and compassion for all sentient beings. That's very generally. And more like practically, my background is investigative journalism. I was a journalist in the Israeli television, working in a TV show which was focused on doing undercover work. So I worked in like an elderly house and doing investigations for humans. And then I did the same for animals, working in slaughterhouses, first in Israel, then in other places abroad, like Australia and other places. And my last work was the CEO. Before what I was doing now, I was the CEO of Sentient, which is a meta nonprofit in the investigative space, helping undercover investigators all over the world who are working for animals do their job. And with that, we also had some even, I would say, technological projects like creating a camera on animal, which is a small camera we developed, which is camouflaged on the body of the animal, in order to enhance individual storytelling, animal storytelling, telling the stories, the tales of particular individual named animals, and not just the story of a facility or an industry, which is what I did as a journalist. I always told here's the story of this slaughterhouse. I wanted to tell the story of Tom. Tom is a very specific animal that I personally followed for 8 hours, with this camera. So we did stuff like that. And what I was also doing throughout my career is promoting alternative proteins, mainly through a nonprofit in Israel. So my career has been kind of in the intersection of technology and animals and humans. Now, and I guess we'll get into that later, I'm starting a new initiative, which is called the Moral Alignment Center, which is focused on making sure that AI is a positive force for all sentient beings. And I think you mentioned the right fundamental questions of what is good, how do we get there to what is good. And surprisingly, I don't think those questions are asked enough in the AI space, and we can get to that in more detail. generally speaking, I would say I really love and like to start or to help, to be part of a group that is starting some new field, some new space, like me and other activists did in Israel with undercover investigations for farmed animals, like with alternative proteins, which like a decade ago seems like, very wacky and at least cultured meat seems like a very wacky thing to try to promote. And now with moral alignment, where I think there are already amazing people doing some wonderful work in it. And I hope this nascent field will expand very significantly.
Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating career today, and the sort of interventions and advocacy and initiatives you've driven is like such a broad range of interventions. It's fascinating. And I think we will come back to it later on, but there's a lot of skepticism about the AI space, but regardless of your stance on it, it's going to be important in many different ways, whether people like it or not. And I agree that it gives us another chance to come back to revisiting some of these deep philosophical questions. I mean, we have no choice but to do that. And that's helping expose how neglected these big questions have been in lots of mainstream thought, public intellectualism, and even philosophy. I think it's a really good chance to come back to some of these foundational questions and just really insist that we address them well, because the implications can be pretty bleak if we don't. So yeah, we'll come back to that later on. Thank you.
And it's very natural, I think, to come back to them. And when I read people who are for years have been working on AI stuff, all of them somehow are aware of this point and thinking about our relationship with animals, pondering about some moral questions. So on the one hand, what is like on the surface out there is really, the ethical question is very neglected, but it is in the minds of people like Ilya Sutskever and Ray Kurzweil and many other people, Sam Altman, many people who are at the forefront of AI forecasting, AI technology, thinking about those questions.
Yeah, it's at least at the back of their minds, isn't it? And we can help bring it to the front of their minds too, maybe. So let's start with the first of these crazily broad philosophical questions, the question of what's real. And more formally, that's, I guess, epistemology. How do we come to know things? I find that, if anything, more interesting than the list of beliefs we might end up with. But so it covers almost every topic of facts that you might encounter. But often an interesting way into it is the question of religion and the supernatural, and whether people grew up in a more supernaturally, spiritually, religiously minded context, family and society, or one that was maybe more scientifically minded, more naturalistic, more evidence and reason grounded, and how that side of their thinking has changed over their life, if it has. So I don't know if you want to start with that story and explain how you think about, the foundations of reality today.
Yes, I live and I grew up in Israel, which is a very religious country. I think in the West, maybe one of the most religious countries. Not my close family, like my parents are secular. I grew up in a secular family, but my relatives are Orthodox, even ultra-Orthodox. So religion is very much all around you as you grow up in Israel. And I think I started to think very seriously about the question, what is, when I was traveling in India, like 2 decades ago, approximately. And I remember the question I asked myself back then was, what do I know for sure? 100%, not 99%. What do I know for sure? I think it's a good place to start, because you start with what you know for sure, and then you build on what you don't know for sure, but you think it's like 90% and then 80% and then 50%, right? Let's start from what you say, okay, there is no chance this is not true. And I think the obvious answer is subjective experiences at this moment, the momentary subjective experiences. So I know now I have a subjective experience of talking to you. I know I'm seeing you. I cannot say in 100% that I know how you feel, that I know that you exist, that I know that you're not some AI, clone that they made in order for me to talk to someone or on drugs or hallucinations. But my subjective experience is certainly true. This is what I experience. So I think
could even that be an illusion? Or by definition, can it not be an illusion in the way you think? Because there are some people who would suggest that this really powerful sense of subjectivity itself is in some way illusory. But
I think it's funny to think about it as an illusion because subjective experience is the only information you will ever receive in your life. It's the only input. By the way, for science as well, like science is just the discipline of trying through rationality to predict subjective experiences of humans. That's science, if you think about it. Even if at the end you see some sensor who says that the result is 400 and that, and that is in alignment with the equations. A 400 is a subjective experience of someone sitting and seeing the number 400. So if all the information I will ever get is subjective experience, it's hard for me to understand how you can call that an illusion and something else is real. That's the only thing that we have. So we know for sure.
So if it is an illusion, it's still all we've got. So what?
It's a hell of an illusion.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's fascinating. Thank you. And there's obviously quite a lot of philosophical thinkers who've sort of taken that approach. And, Descartes, I guess, was a classic one of just trying to go back to the absolute basics and where do I start from? So it's a really interesting stance that subjectivity is, the thing you're most solidly convinced of. Now, some people would, if you like, get stuck there and say maybe it's the only thing that's real, and that can lead you into sort of maybe, as you were saying, doubting that anything else or anyone else exists. How do you think about that? Or have you come to a position where, yes, your subjectivity is the most solid thing, but it can also give you an appreciation for what else, might probably be out there? How do you think about going beyond the subjective in terms of facts? And
I actually think that starting from your own subjective experiences and seeing that as the core reality that we're sure of, it actually brings you more compassion. It's a more humble approach because I have to be a bit humble on everything that is outside my subjective experiences, especially like this theory, which I like. I have nothing against, but of matter and the material world and everything, But at the end, all is your subjective experiences. So I think there's something right in viewing all of the outside, not other subjective experiences, but at least the material world as a kind of simulation. It's good in the sense that it keeps you a bit humble. This is what I know for sure. I know for sure that I saw something, that I felt something, but this is only what I know. It doesn't mean that this other person or other subjective being is feeling that. So I think this kind of perspective brings you more humbleness and more caring, and also it brings you to appreciate other sentient beings more. And I'll explain why. For example, let's say I'm holding a red rose. And I'm saying, wow, this is a beautiful red rose. I would say, hold on a second. The rose is not red. It's red to you. It's not physically red. It's not that there is an objective reality of a red rose outside you. It's you who are seeing through a very particular filter. And we know this. Our mind filters the information. We don't see everything that there is. We cannot even sense everything that there is. So we sing from a very narrow perspective. So if I understand that is not a red rose outside, I having a subjective experience of a red rose, and suddenly you come in or a dog come in, I can understand, wow, okay, I'm seeing it as a red rose. The dog sees it in something completely else. Maybe the dog doesn't see it as red. Maybe what I call red is what you call green, but that's another question. So I think it may sound like it could bring you to be like selfish, like only I exist, but I think it's the other way around. It brings you compassion. So you start with that. And then I think with rationality, you get to the conclusion that probably there's a very good probability that other humans are sentient, that other mammals are sentient, birds are sentient. Probably, as science tells us, almost all vertebrates are sentient, maybe even some invertebrates. So I think for me, the start was the subjective experience as the ground that everything is based on. And I think it's a bit different than how usually people think about it. And you can see it, for example, in the hard problem of consciousness. That why don't they call it the hard problem of matter? Like I start from consciousness. That is the thing that is sure. And then you ask, okay, how does this consciousness bring about matter? Or how it interacts with matter? Whether there is matter? How do we have all this? How do we have all these consistency in our subjective experiences? That's one of the amazing things, right? How do we get to all of this theory of matter and everything around us? It's that we have a very consistent subjective experience, at least when we are awake, not when we are asleep. and that we can also describe the world in these mathematical formulas, which is even more astonishing, right? That you can write some formula that describes subjective experiences of scientists, of your own. So I think that brings about the whole theory of matter and atoms and molecules and all of these equations. And science has done an amazing job in predicting all of this. But still, the core, the basis, the start is not the matter, it's the inside, it's not the outside, because that's what we know for sure.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. Now, you've hinted at it already, but one risk with completely centering the subjective as if you like the only thing we're really sure exists is, could it lead to a sort of relativism about reality where anyone can just declare the facts that they feel are true, and because our subjectivities are distinct and separate and in some way unchallengeable, there is no way of constructively cooperating to work out what the truth might be, or challenging each other because, well, it's your reality, it's your way of knowing, it's your truth. And, sometimes that doesn't necessarily have to be dangerous because people have different opinions, right? But it is useful to be able to constructively work out what might be true together. And you can take extreme examples of people who might actually be hallucinating or might feel they've had a, religious revelation where God tells them to do something. And if we don't have a way of engaging with that, or they refuse to engage with challenges to that because their subjectivity is inviolate, that can lead to difficult places. So how do you avoid that risk of a sort of relativistic approach where everyone has their own separate stance and there's nothing we can do to work together?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem because it's like they say everybody's got their own truth, but I say everybody's got their own lie. And maybe truth is there is one truth. Okay, your subjective experience is your truth. My subjective experience is my truth. I think that we see with our ability to explore the world through science, through our subjective experiences, which are very consistent in certain situations, in certain ways, we can see that probably, we don't see any evidence of dualism, which means that if I shook your hand and you're saying you punch me in the face, we don't see any evidence that is real, that you really have an experience of being punched in the face if I just shook your hand. So I think looking at it from and looking at reality, first from a subjective perspective, allows you to stretch a little bit and to be, let's say, more, I would say, humble in telling people how they should feel or how they do feel, or in saying they're lying because they interpret the situation differently. But you cannot stretch it too far, I think, because we just see that there is no dualism, at least none that we know of. So the materialistic world, as science understands it, should correlate to what you are feeling and what you are subjectively experiencing. So I think what you're saying is true. It's a problem, but I'm just saying I think we should stretch a little bit the lines in between, but not tear it apart completely.
Yeah, thank you. And how has that shifted the way you think about religious ways of thinking or supernatural ways of thinking? How do you think about them in this context of subjectivity and reality? Like you said, I guess you grew up with secular Jewish parents rather than religious Jewish parents. So I presume that was your sort of starting point. But how have you come to think about the religious and the supernatural in this context now?
I guess I did early on. I did chose to go in the rational way. I think you can also ask, why do you choose the rationality and not some belief system, for example? And why is it rational to choose rationality? Because this was before you chose it. So I'm not claiming that choosing rationality is like the rational thing to do, but it's still, it was my choice. And I do think it's the right choice. And having done that, I don't see a lot of evidence for supernatural. But then again, if I do see, I will just include it in the natural world. So if you look at, if you look at the quantum physics, you could have thought like 100 years ago, this is supernatural, this is crazy, it's stuff we never thought. But then once you start seeing that the world acts according to it in a very consistent way, you just say, okay, it's within our natural framework. So I think supernatural, if you mean, is there like a good God, or is there a big intelligence that is overseeing everything? I think the evidence don't point to it being a good God. It's hard for me to understand how they can be a compassionate God. Seeing, wild animals suffering, seeing what humans are doing, seeing what animals are doing to each other, seeing the world, which is scaling. The world is like, if you look at the history of the world, it seems to be scaling in concentration of power, scaling more and more. Humans are getting more and more powerful, and in intelligence. Humans and the machines they're creating getting more and more intelligent, but it doesn't scale in compassion. It doesn't scale in wisdom, in actions which lead to better subjective experiences. If there was a compassionate God, maybe all of us would have been happy anyway. But if not, maybe you would have seen a trajectory. Maybe evolution would not be the survival of the fittest, or us, you and me being sort of created or crafted to bring on those genes or those means forward, but just to make everybody feel better and have better subjective experiences. You don't see the world being handled this way. You don't see the laws of physics, of biology pushing in that direction. So I don't think there are good reasons to think there is a good God. If you ask about a general superintelligence, I also don't see a lot of evidence for that. But I have to say there is the fine-tuning argument, if you're familiar with that, which says that if you look at the constants of the basic laws of physics, like gravity and other powers, they are like exactly tuned to the number which enables life to exist. If you just move them a little bit to the left or to the right, those numbers, you won't have anything interesting in the world. Molecules cannot be formed. Atoms will be separated apart. I think there are better counter arguments to that. So this is an argument to say maybe there is a creator, maybe some very intelligent thing crafted the numbers exactly. Otherwise, how do you explain that exactly the way that enables life? I think there are some good counter arguments to that. Also, there could be a lot of universes. This is just the one that we're speaking to because, these are the numbers.
Yeah, I find that a really interesting argument, because I don't find it pulls on me too hard, because in a sense, there's the classic, the anthropic response where you're saying, well, yes, but by virtue of the fact we're here, we could never have observed any other type of universe. So either it wasn't tuned in this way, in which we would never be here, or it was, and in which case, self-evidently, we already are. So we've learned nothing new. And I'm not clever enough to get into the philosophy around that, because there's all sorts of really interesting arguments that go different ways. But the other thing I find interesting about the fine-tuning argument is, if there's fine-tuning, and the term itself implies there's a tuner, right? So there's a bit of smuggling in of the desired conclusion there. But if the universe is fine-tuned for life, it's not just fine-tuned for life, it's fine-tuned for you and me to be having this conversation on this podcast today. So maybe we are the point of the creator's universe, right? It's quite interesting what you think about, what is it fine-tuned for? Because when you talk about it being fine-tuned for life, that gives you certain conclusions. When you think about it being fine-tuned for you and me talking now, it seems a little bit more ridiculous. So but I think it's interesting as a start. Yeah, pause for thought at least.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting argument. I think it's the best one for a creator. I'm not convinced at all by this, but I think it's the best one that I heard.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, that's fine. So my final question on this sort of how do we understand reality question, particularly because you focus so hard on subjectivity, is the question of meditation, which I know is something you've practiced for a long while. Because in my conversations, there are many people who, through meditative practice or through work with psychedelics, have come to see the plasticity of the human mind in a radically new way. It's like, oh my God, the things we can experience are very different from the default human set of experiences. But there are others for whom meditation or use of psychedelics is more analogous to a sort of religious revelation, where it hasn't just changed the way they think about their subjectivity, it's changed the way they think about the nature of reality itself, right? And obviously there are slightly silly examples where people are talking about 7-dimensional meta-elves that are controlling the universe, right? Okay, fine. But some people genuinely do, through a meditative experience or a psychedelic experience, really genuinely think they've seen a different aspect to external reality. What's your experience with meditation, and has that shifted the way you think about reality and epistemology, or not?
Yeah. I think, of course, it has shifted the way I look at things. First, I mean, for me, meditation is just a technique of self-investigation. The way that you investigate the outside and what is real, you investigate the inside of what is real and try to understand yourself better. And I also think it's because you realize that you see the world through a certain filter, and you only know your subjective experiences. So you realize how much you are limited in this world. I like to say that like the beam of light is very narrow and the darkness is very vast. So you're like always, and you don't want to search only under the street light. So you're trying, to grasp, and you're trying to understand what's going on around you. And investigating the inside is a very good way to do that. Now, I have been very influenced by Buddhism, but I think more so by specifically the branch of Vipassana. I've done Goenka Vipassana, which is a 10-day meditation course, and later on you practice at home. I've done it like 5-6 times. And the thing that I understand from Vipassana is that actually Buddha was kind of like, Buddha was a statistician, because he actually said, like, to me, yes, this is how I understand. He said to me, look, Ronen, you're suffering in your life. You also have happy moments, but you're suffering also. And you're always blaming the outside in your suffering. You're suffering because this person said something, and this good thing didn't happen, and that thing didn't happen. And you're confusing correlation for causation. You're not suffering because, let's say Jamie told me something which is really bad. Now I'm furious at Jamie. And then when Jamie said this thing, a sensation arose in my body. I started feeling unpleasant sensations all over the body. And then I react to those sensations. So there is a variable, a medium variable after Jamie said something, which is the body sensations. And I'm actually reacting to those sensations, not to what you said. So there is a correlation between bad things happening like on the outside and me feeling bad, but it's a correlation. It's not a causation. And once you observe those sensations, just observe them, watch them, and try not to react to them, you see that they pass away and they don't have this hold on you. And if you're ignorant to those, I find on myself, if I'm ignorant to those sensations, I don't observe them, I just live with them, they have a much stronger hold on me, and then I suffer more. So this is something that I discovered from practicing Vipassana. This is part of the Vipassana philosophy. And it just makes you look much more on the inside. Everything that happens in life. You're nervous now. Let's see where it is. Let's see what I'm feeling on the inside. You're happy. Let's see where it is in the body. What do I feel? What do I feel now? And it's just a way to look at every situation in life. And I think our evolutionary path, and I think to a large extent also our language, is always drawing us to the outside, to focus on the outside and not to the inside. I wrote this article, which is called "The Environmental Terminology is Killing the Individual Animal," which is about how when we speak in environmental terms, it's like hiding the sentient and highlighting the insentient. The green, the trees, like you would say, oh, the meat industry is causing deforestation. You will not say it's killing wild monkeys, right? And I think after thinking about it for a long time, I think it's not only the environmental terminology, also our whole language to an extent is highlighting the outside insentient objects and hiding the inside subjective experiences, feelings. This is why when you say, oh, look, that's a beautiful red rose, you would say that like that's reality outside of you, like that's an objective reality, though it's a subjective experience. It's not an objective reality. That rose is red in your eyes. And probably the redness of it is like it's red in the exact particular way that you understand red. Maybe it's only you sees that way. We don't know. So I think just generally, I would say Vipassana and meditation just makes me look a lot more on the inside. But then it also, the way I analyze situations in life, I try to look at the inside of others. Like if there is a particular situation, try to see what he thinks, how he feels in that situation. And just seeing the world more as subjective experiences and not as objective realities.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that cues up perfectly the second and third big questions, the questions of ethics. And you've sort of hinted already at, I think, how you'll link the two. And I think this idea of subjectivity is going to be core to it. But there is this deep question about, okay, what matters? What do good and bad and right and wrong even mean if you really dig down? And I'm interested in people's journey on that front. How did you start out thinking about those sort of basics of ethics and morals as a kid in a secular Jewish household? And have you come to think about those foundations now?
Yeah, I think it starts from me from the question, what is? And once I mean, the way that I define what is inside the word exists is subjective experiences. It's a bit of semantics, but I think it's also a bit of philosophy because, like, for me, if you say there is some star far in the galaxy, no one has ever saw it. No one will ever see it. It has no influence on any subjective experience of any being. I don't think you should say this star exists. I don't think it exists. And if you do say it exists, think about it. You're trying to imagine the star. You're trying to imagine a subjective experience of the star. Don't do that. It's very easy to say, oh, no, but never mind, it exists. And then you think you see it. If you think that you see it, it means that there is some kind of subjective experience of it. So I think if you think down deep on it, if this star has no implications on subjective experience whatsoever, it shouldn't be included within existence. It doesn't exist.
So I find that approach fascinating, and it's one I don't think I've heard of before, although there are some philosophers who have sort of talked about that stance. The unobserved tree in the forest falling, does it make a sound, that type of thing. But it does lead to quite a weird implication, which is before sentience evolved, and I think it has evolved, I think sentience, the capacity to perceive, the capacity for subjectivity probably evolved, I don't know, sometime in the Precambrian, a long while ago, hundreds of millions of years ago. That implies before the moment of the first sentient being having some sort of spark, nothing existed at all. So the Big Bang didn't exist, galaxy formulation didn't exist, crystallization of plasma didn't exist, galaxies and all of that stuff didn't exist. But they came into existence once we had the capacity to retrospectively find evidence of them. Is that what you're saying? Is the universe didn't exist until the first sentient being?
It's a very interesting perspective. I have to say, I didn't think about it this way, looking at from like backwards. It's funny because sometimes the one of the claims against religion is how monotheistic religion, how can you say the world is 5,000 years old? That's why the scriptures say, the Bible. And then they say the world was created old. That was one of the explanations. So I feel like a little bit wanting to say that. But
the fossils were placed there just to test us. Yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting perspective. I need to think about it. But I think that for me, morality is just what exists. If within existence there is only subjective experiences, so it's quite easy. What is important? What exists? It's like someone that I spoke to a friend told me, you EAP people, like effective altruism people, you're only on subjective experiences. What about beauty? And I was like saying to him, beauty is a subjective experience. What about this? What about that? Why is subjective experience the most important thing? And I told him, oh, it's not the most important thing. It's the only thing. I like this. I thought about like a riddle, which goes, how does it go? It's not a thing and it's not matter, but it's the only thing and it's the only thing that matters. What is it? Subjective experiences.
And I've tried a similar experiment and I've never yet heard a convincing argument. Can someone explain to me why something is of value without referring to sentience at all? And people will come up with lists, but when you ask, well, why is that important? Why is that important? And why is that important? Do the classic 5-year-old child thing of just keep asking why. The root always seems to be subjective experience. It seems to be the experience of a sentient being, right? So I don't know if that's the root of all value and ultimately the root of all morality and ethics, but I haven't found another one yet. And all the alternatives people suggest seem to be instrumental or indirect, or like you say, beauty or truth or knowledge, to me only seem to be of importance ultimately because of their importance to a sentient being. And when something is important to a sentient being, it matters to them. And I would say, so it should matter to us if we want to claim we are moral, right? But so I find it fascinating.
For me, it's fascinating that language all across the world structured and framed the words in this particular way. If I would have done it, I would include just subjective experiences within existence. And then I think the morality that you and I hold is much more natural within language, saying, what do you care about? Everything that exists. That's what I care about. And I mean, funny enough, in Hebrew, you don't even have the word sentient. Like the most fundamental word that divides what I would say existent and non-existent, you don't have a word in Hebrew that is sentient. You have consciousness, of course, and stuff, but not sentient.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So you really tie the two together very tightly. Now, and I, personally, I like that approach of thinking about subjectivity being the grounding of morality and ethics. And people will say, well, okay, but why is suffering bad or why is flourishing good? And it's like, well, because they are good or bad to the individual being that is experiencing them almost by definition. So that for me is a pretty solid grounding. Although, of course, you can have I love teenage boys, but you can have fascinating conversations with teenage boys on the internet about why suffering isn't intrinsically bad. Anyway, let's put that to one side. But the follow-on question is about, okay, well, then who gets to matter? Because I think there are many people who would sort of roughly agree with you that, subjectivity is important and the experiencing being matters. But many people haven't yet worked out the implications of that for their moral scope and who gets to matter. So I'd be really interested in your journey because, I'm sure growing up as a kid, you weren't necessarily thinking about, the nature of subjectivity and the nature of existence and so on. But what journey did you go through in working out who matters? Family, friends, other human beings you've never encountered all around the world. The question of non-human animals. How did you go through that journey yourself? And how do you think now about who gets to matter?
Yeah, so I think if I try to remember back when I was really a small kid, I was very influenced by a song, which is called in Hebrew, I'm a Green Child. But it's a translation of an English song, which is called Natural by Juan Pardo. But anyway, it's an Hebrew translation. It's a beautiful song. And it kind of, I think, instilled some identity within me of I'm a green child. I like nature. I like animals. It's quite common with kids. It's nothing uncommon. But I did have that identity. And I remember as a child, like in the early 90s, going to school on a path which is paved and thinking wild animals must have died for me to walk on this path. So I think I always had the sense that when I see civilization, I realize it's inherently tied to destruction of life, to killing wild animals. It's very obvious to me. It's all around. It's like I cannot see anything without seeing that. And I think I also saw that as a kid. Not that it was like a cloud over my head, and as a child, I thought about that all the time. But somehow I realized that. And I was a child who loved animals. But then I think the real shock for me was to find out about factory farming and the fact that we exploit and abuse animals so much. And the fact that the world that I lived in, which I kind of thought of maybe was kind of moral, maybe not to wild animals, but it's not like I didn't grow up as a child thinking we live in a horrible world where atrocities are happening. And that's changed once I realized what we're doing to farm animals, also people around the world, but the enormity of what we're doing to farm animals and the fact that we are doing it.
And how did you find out about that? And what age were you when you first started to see that?
Only like 21, 22, just on the internet. And then I started going to these places, filming the farms, talking to the farmers, trying to understand, because I was very skeptic. I was like, no way that is true. No way all of these things are true. And of course, later on, working as an undercover in slaughterhouses, you get to see a whole new perspective of what it's like to be there. But also, I think it's interesting. You get a perspective of how much other people's views influence you. Because let's say when I worked, for example, in what was then the biggest slaughterhouse in Israel for a month and a half, you're doing crazy things. Everything is so crazy. All of this is just a killing machine. They're killing animals as fast as possible, horrible abuse of animals. But then everybody sits to eat and talking about how your wife is feeling and drinking something and laughing, and everything is like, okay. And me, which I'm an undercover investigator, I understand that I'm in a crazy place. Something inside me cannot help but tell myself, no, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's okay. Maybe everything's fine. Just because everyone around you behaves that way, it's so strong. And then
It's
you
so
really,
normal. It's so normal. Yeah.
you get to see the implications of your surroundings on your views, on your thoughts. And one day I understood that I was not only working in a slaughterhouse. When I was working in a slaughterhouse, to an extent, we are all living in one big slaughterhouse, right? We're living in a civilization which is very cruel to animals, which is abusing animals, but also that I think we can, and we'll talk about it later on, I think we have a great opportunity now to change that, to take a different role. Humanity is not taking the role of stewardship, of caring, of providing for other sentient beings. Let's be honest about it. We didn't take that role, none whatsoever. But now we have a chance to rectify with AI.
Yeah, thank you. So that's a beautiful segue. It's almost like we planned it, because the final question is, how do we make a better future? So if we've got this stance where we center our subjectivity in how we understand the world, but we recognize that, at least probabilistically, that's giving us a sense of an external reality that exists out there, and there are other subjective beings who also matter. And that mattering of the subjective being grounds our morality, how we think about what's right and what's wrong. And we recognize that logically, we can't just pick some sentient beings with subjectivity to care about. If we care about some logically, and we care about subjectivity and sentience, we must care about all sentient beings. That leads to the next big question: what the hell do we do? And as you said, what potentially could be the role of humanity and other powerful agents going forward? So your history's been fascinating, because so much of your career has been focused on, trying to make that happen, right? Whether it's the investigations work, whether it's your advocacy work, you've done work in, law and consumption change and policy change with different effects there. And you've done work in the alt protein space, again, trying to come up with some alternatives that are more compassionate and less harmful. So I'm really interested in, to start with this question about how do we make a better future, whether you do have a sort of grand utopian vision overall about the path forward for humanity. And then maybe we can get into some of the more specific levers you've got experience of pulling, and then, your new idea. Where would you start?
Yeah, I would start with maybe the problem. And the problem is that we have a huge scale in intelligence in the world. Humans are getting much more intelligent with AI as their friends. AIs are getting much more intelligent, but we don't see the same scale in compassion. And that is very dangerous. Now, wisdom is the action of rationale, of intelligence, and the compassion. If you act with compassion, but also with understanding the world, so you understand what is good, you're acting with wisdom. And the analogy I give to this is like someone driving a car. The more intelligent, the more capable, the more powerful humanity is, humanity and AI together, the speed of the car is faster. And the ethics is like the skill of the driver. So we're in a very dangerous situation. Now, if the car is moving very slowly and the driver is very skilled, so a good ethics, but not a lot of power, that's okay. There is no problem. But now the car is speeding so fast that we might, run into something. We might crash. But our skills, our morality is not as advanced. So I think we need to very profoundly understand that and shift much of our attention into ethics. Now is the time. Now is the time to scale our ethics the same way that we scale our intelligence, which is scaling, you cannot follow it. Every day they invent something new. Every day the AI is getting smarter. Every day you have like 6 new models, but you don't have 6 new models of morality, of better morality every day. We don't scale in that. So I would say that's the big problem. But we also have, I think, a huge opportunity here. And AI is changing the game in ways that it's still hard to say. But for one thing, The fact that we are able to much better manipulate our environment can mean that the conflict of interest that we have between us and animals will slowly go down, will not be as prominent as it was in the past. We didn't kill all those wild animals and did all of this stuff because we like it, because we're sadists, because we like suffering. We just, we like homes, and the squirrel also like his tree, but okay, we preferred our home on his tree or our food or anything else. But then if we're really able to manipulate our environments, maybe we don't need it. Maybe we'll be able, it's like you'll be able to reach your destination without causing habitat fragmentation. Let's put it this way. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think we have to remember that there's a very big difference between our stated values and our actions. In the core, human stated values are good. Like if you ask someone, do you want animals to be hurt? Who would say he wants animals to be hurt? Who wants suffering? Who's holding signs, promote suffering? No one's doing that. And that is because at the core, we really don't want it. But when we have a conflict of interest, our deeds are not always our deeds follow our actions. But I think AI is our chance to be more morally aligned to our true values, because AI will enable us to do that, but also to bring forward our stated values and not so much our deeds. And there is...
So there's a hope here that, again, it's a really interesting dynamic, because in some situations, scarcity can get people to bond together and be more ethical. You can see how people respond to natural disasters or wars often, and people, will pull together in solidarity. But at the same time, as you said, in times of scarcity, there's conflict of interests and violence and outgroup derogation and colonialism and all sorts of other horrors as well. So you're saying that maybe there's a path to a more sort of state of abundance, where just because we can all have more of the things we want, there'll be less inherent conflict and less need to oppress others, human and non-human. Which I guess is the hopeful story about artificial intelligence, that it can lead to that sort of state of abundance. Have you got a sense of, and we'll come on to the risks later, right? But have you got a sense of what those paths might look like for how could artificial intelligence actually help us get to a state of more abundance? Is it about narrow use cases or general ones, or what do you think those positive options are before we talk about some of the risks?
And there are major risks. I mean, it can reduce the conflict of interest, but create new conflicts of interest. For example, with perhaps in the future sentient digital minds. So there are a lot of risks. I'm not saying it's a straightforward utopia, but I think with AI we might reach a state where our R&D, our scientific progress, is so fast that we don't have an energy crisis and nuclear fusion is solved. So we have abundance of energy. We can manipulate materials, so we don't need agriculture to be outside the cities. We don't need animal agriculture. If we solve quantum computers, we can simulate a lot of real world scenarios, and we don't have to actually do that to understand how to progress to the next drug, to the next discovery. It's a bit hard to say because it's such an abundant intelligence, and it could be recursive. So, AI improves itself, which improves itself, which improves itself. So it's really hard to predict.
Yeah, because by definition, it's so far beyond your or my capabilities to... Yeah.
It's also so general. It's the way to think about it could be your intelligence. It's much more general than a cow's intelligence. And a cow could never probably understand what inventions you could reach to. The same way AI is going to be more intelligent than us. The difference between AI and us, or super intelligence, might be bigger than the difference between us and a cow. So it's very hard to understand and to see. But generally, the ability to manipulate the outside and also to change the inside. I mean, we have progressed to an extent with helping people with depression, helping people feel better through drugs, through meditation, through techniques. You can see it as kind of an alignment techniques. I'm trying to be aligned with my values, with being happy in life and stuff like that. But I think humanity in general is much more successful in engineering the outside world, not the inside world, though we have some successes in that as well. With AI, we could have enormous successes with the inside, with the outside, with everything. So it can really transform everything. And I think every time of great transformation, new values arise, new religions arise, new values. This is a time where everything is like reshaped and reshaped like a shaker. And you see what comes out of it. And this is a huge opportunity for us, for people who try to promote sentientism.
Yeah. And what would you say to people who are more skeptical about the capacities of artificial intelligence? Because people who are more skeptical will use it, one, to say, look, the risks aren't as high as people say, but they also say that the positive opportunities aren't really there either. So they will acknowledge that, modern AI capabilities are radically better than they were even 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And they will probably grudgingly acknowledge that, the benchmarks we used to set for mind-blowing AI capabilities that will never be reached were then reached faster and faster and faster. But I think many people
and then say, no, this is not the right benchmark. I have another one.
I know. I'm sort of making this too easy for you, right? But some people do have a sense that ultimately there will be some sort of hard limit where, whether it's the transformer architecture or LLMs or even the narrow AIs, we'll just sort of get to a point and flatten out and sort of stop moving forward. Do you have a sense as to, whether that's also a possibility, or are you locked in that, these capabilities are just going to keep accelerating and will be unimaginable for good or ill?
I mean, if you look at Moore's law and you look at humans' history with scaling intelligence, we have, I think, all the data to think that this is going to continue. But whether it's going to be in the transformer architecture, whether it's going to be LLMs, some, experts like Yann LeCun, one of the godfathers of AI, thinks it's not going to be LLMs who's going to reach artificial general intelligence. So whether it's this technology or the other technology, I cannot say. How far can we scale with LLMs? Maybe there is some limit. By the way, even Sam Altman from OpenAI says probably there is some limit to LLMs. Maybe that will not get us into super intelligence. At least that's what he said a year ago or something. Maybe now he thinks differently. But that is not to say that we won't invent another technology. Now, I don't have very exact timelines to say, like some people, in 5 years, we're going to reach AGI and all the jobs are going to be replaced or something like that. I don't know. I think maybe it will take a bit longer than that. But so whether it will take 5 years to reach what they call AGI, let's say that if we define it very quickly, it means that artificial intelligence is able to perform almost all of human economical activities better than the average person and at an expert level. Let's put it this way. Whether we reach AGI in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, it seems that it will come, and it will come soon. Even if it's in 30 years, that's quite soon. Looking at futurists like Ray Kurzweil, who did predict a lot of things right, he thinks it's going to be 2029 when we reach AGI. So I think it's very good to prepare for this age. And if it comes a bit later, 10 years or 20 years, we're not losing anything by preparing to it. On the contrary, I wish it would come a bit later because we will have more time to prepare for it.
Yeah, thank you. Now, one thing that's distinctive about your approach that I like is that when you're talking about the positive potential benefits of AIs, you're not just thinking about the benefits to humans, you're thinking about the benefits to all sentient beings. So that's distinctive and really important. And I think that's one of the interventions you're trying to make into the modern AI space is the beneficiaries and the victims are not just the humans, right? We're a tiny percentage of the sentient beings that could be impacted for good or for ill. But if we turn to the risks, we've got to do the same thing there. What are the sort of downsides that you see if we continue on a sort of default path with the development of artificial intelligence, which, as you said, is a little bit like pushing our foot on the accelerator, but not really having a steering wheel or a brake? What do you think because even here, there are lots of different fights going on. There are people who are concerned about, future existential risks and the potential for artificial general intelligence to become like an alien new species with superpowers that either destroys us or treats us as irrelevant and leads to our destruction. And there are people who are fighting against them and saying, no, the real problem is just in current AI in terms of its bias and its fabrication and its undermining of human epistemology. And it's much more a sort of day-to-day social media, artificial intelligence technology fear. What's your sense about the portfolio of, potential bad outcomes here for non-human and human sentient beings from AI?
So the risks are enormous. And I think that the analogy you suggested is correct. We should view this as like an alien species which came to Earth like 4 years ago. And you see how much this species is developing. Its evolution is not as slow as human evolution. So 3 years ago, he didn't knew anything, almost anything in math. And today he's solving math problems, which I look at and I cannot understand even what is the problem. What is all these crazy numbers and figures? You cannot even articulate what it is. And once you see this alien species accelerating so fast in his intelligence, you will say, okay, I realize what's going to be in 5 years and 10 years with this species. Now, generally, people, especially in the EA, are thinking about what is called X risk, existential risks, AI killing everybody, including animals, humans, everybody. I think that's a real risk, a true risk that we have to address. It's as urgent as nuclear risks and other risks. And I think most of the people who are at the forefront of the AI companies agree to that and even signed a letter stating that.
And that stance is one of those views that for many people just sounds too alien. It's too science fiction. It's too radical. It's too, it's like taking the Black Mirror series and going like way stages beyond. It just cannot even conceive of it being a viable opinion to hold. To someone who feels like that, is there a way you found of making that real, that people could actually engage with it as a possibility? How could you imagine that play out? And again, it's difficult to say how you'd imagine it, because by definition, beings like us wouldn't be the ones in control, right? But to help other people understand the possibility, what sort of paths can you imagine that realistically could actually happen here?
So Eliezer Yudkowsky, one of the founders of the AI safety space, has very good YouTube videos with the detailed explanations on what he thinks. Of course, this superintelligence might think of a better way to kill us all. But for example, create a virus or a bacteria in a lab, which will kill all humanity, creating bioweapons, even to an extent, social disruptions like creating so much data that you cannot distinguish between right and wrong can create a lot of social disruption. Think about the whole internet space, which is the space that most of us live in today, being filled with a lot of information, a lot of videos, a lot of pictures, a lot of text, and you have no idea to know whether this is true. This podcast that you're seeing now, was it real? Or was it just created by an AI and there is no way to distinct between this and reality? So I think the dangers are very real. And if you think about the smartest scientist that you know in the world, if he was to work in some lab and try to figure out how to kill humanity, would you be worried? But if there were 1,000 such scientists, and if there were 1,000,000 such scientists, there is no limit almost to the intelligence of general artificial intelligence, a super intelligence later on, that can have a lot of compute and a lot of power and also can deceive us. We don't exactly know what the capabilities of AI are. We can train the model and talk to him and try to understand what he really thinks. But at the end, we also seeing those in research that the model a lot of times is deceiving. He's deceiving the people who are trying to test him, and he understands that he's being tested. And he's deliberately deceiving the testers. So if you have a super intelligence, and also I would say to them, try to see the dynamics in nature and in the universe. Do you have the dynamics where a very intelligent species is being controlled by a less intelligent species? Are cows controlling us or we are controlling cows? What is the dynamics? And the dynamics usually is that the more intelligent, or always, not usually, always, the more intelligent species, the more intelligent being is in control of the less intelligent being. Now, it doesn't mean that will be the case, but it means that something extraordinary needs to happen in order for us not to be in the case 10 years from now, 20 years from now, where a less intelligent species, humans, are controlling a more intelligent species, AI. So for the extraordinary, we have to take this very seriously and invest a lot of efforts into it. And still, AI safety, it's being talked about much more, but still the number of resources allocated to it is just a joke. It's like a bad Hollywood movie or something like that. It's nothing. It's really
Thank you. And there's a few challenges I've heard. One is we could just unplug it. And I'm not sure you quite understand how global compute in the cloud operates today, but that's quite hard to do. Even a Roomba will work to, find its way back to the power source, let alone a Roomba with a remote drone that can, stop you getting in its way.
How
right?
can you plug it out if it's already copied itself into 1,000 different places?
Yeah.
All over the internet. Yeah.
Exactly. And there are ideas about, can you build kill chips into the NVIDIA chips? And, fine, right? There might be some way of doing it, but this is not a trivial answer. There's some people will say, well, these things can't actually have agency. They can't plan and they can't move things through because they're used to talking to an LLM that does nothing until you ask them a question. But again, that's a trivially easy thing to work around, and new instantiations of those systems are already in place that are doing multi-stage planning and agency. And you can do it yourself. You can ask ChatGPT to imagine there's two different versions of itself and say, go and have a conversation about what to do next. Right? What should we do now? Well, let's do this. How about that? And that's agency, right? That's a basic agency. It's trivially easy to work through. And I think the other thing that I've found useful in conversations with people is if they are familiar with, advanced LLMs, capacity for something that seems like thought and language, imagine what a capable human with lots of resources can do with an internet browser, right? Even that, right? So this isn't even super intelligent. This is just a capable human actor. What can you do? You can take out a hit on someone for $15,000 in most countries, right? You can bribe people, you can blackmail people, you can threaten them. There's cybercrime, right? So even if you take this
just
very
by
basic...
getting into personal emails and personal information, you can blackmail people to build a lab, and then you pay those people because you know how to earn money over the internet. Then you pay those people to create a super bug that will kill humanity. You can do so many things. And again, I just want to reiterate that it's the way to think about it is think about yourself and a cow. Let's say a cow wants to control you and it's scared of you. Maybe it can push you to the corner. That's going to be for 10 seconds. You're going to figure out a way to get around it, and then you will control the cow, not the other way around.
Yeah. So I'm skeptical of some of the claims of potential AI capabilities. I can imagine there might be some limits. Ultimately, there will be physics limits, right? But I think those are so far away from current capabilities, they're somewhat irrelevant at the moment. But I don't find any of the challenges to the capability and potential power of AI to be reassuring at all, right? If we have at least a probabilistic approach and we're saying we're worried about not definite things that will happen, but things that could happen, there's some really, really serious stuff there, right? Even if you only give it a small percentage chance. So I'm not convinced about that, the capability challenge where people say, relax, it's going to be fine. Right? I don't buy it. But then one of the next things people will go to, which I'd be really interested to explore with you, is people will say, well, yeah, but why would super powerful AI want to harm us, right? Why would they be malevolent? Why would they want to do this to us? Wouldn't they be, by virtue of being intelligent, intrinsically be sort of moral and good, and at the worst, just sort of leave us to live our lives happily while they went off and did their AI things, right? Why would they want to be malevolent, or why might they harm us? Which gets us into this question about, this whole podcast is about worldviews, right? We're used to thinking humans have worldviews. The reason I think worldviews are deeply important is because they underpin every human decision we take, whether we examine those worldviews or not. They are there, like the basics of how we understand the world and what we think is good and who we think matters. That drives every decision we take. But now we're in this fascinating world of having to think about potentially artificial intelligences and what worldviews they have. So how do you think about that space and how it plays into the risks and the benefits?
Yeah, so I think that is one of the most neglected, maybe the most neglected space of action currently, which I call moral alignment, which means that not only having AI in the control of humans doing what we want, but also figuring out the question what we want. So it's not only having the power as humans to control AI, but also having the ethics. And that involves, I think, a variety of different approaches which can get us into a truly good world if we have human alignment, which means humans are truly ethical, and then we have AI alignment, which means AI acts ethically, and then AI creates a super intelligence. We have to remember that also. It's not that we will create AI which will become a super intelligence. We will probably create an AI which will create the next AI, which will be a super intelligence. So if humans are aligned and AI is aligned and super intelligence is aligned, we can get to a really, really good world. But that's a hell of a challenge, to make all of these alignments, not only to human control, but also to the right ethics. And that is something which is very much neglected in the AI space and AI in general. It is so neglected that there isn't even a clear term which is agreed upon everybody. How do you call this problem of what are the values that we choose for the AI? I call it value selection. So you have value alignment. Value alignment usually means how do you get AI to act according to the human values? But it's not so much about the question, what are the right values? So I think in general, AI safety is about three main things. First is value selection. What are the values that we give to this AI? The second is technical alignment. How do we make sure AI does what humans want it to do? Otherwise, it's of no good of giving it the good values if it does something else. And the third is AI capabilities. Of course, the more capable it is, the more we have a bigger challenge within technical alignment and within value selection also, because the greater the capabilities, the greater the responsibilities. For example, a very capable AI opens up maybe possibilities to help wild animals, which maybe we have very limited options to help wild animals because of suffering in the wild, which has nothing to do with humans. And probably most suffering in the world is experienced by wild animals due to natural circumstances. That is...
And the sheer numbers of them.
What I assume, yeah. So maybe a very capable AI opens up new possibilities. So these three are very much connected. Currently, the ethical part is so neglected, there isn't even a consensus on how you call it. Different people call it in different ways, but usually it's like out of the scope. So I actually think the most important goal of our generation is to create a super intelligence which is ethical, which is aligned with morality. That's the most important goal of our generation. And if you look at the way that usually this space is taught by effective altruists and also other people in the space, they talk about like rationalists, they talk about existential risks, and they talk about suffering risks. Existential being AI killing everybody, and suffering being it created vast amounts of suffering, enslaving us, maybe like we've enslaved animals, enslaving sentient beings around the world. And then they say, okay, we got to make sure that AI is aligned with human values, and that solves the problem. But actually, if you think about it, if AI is only merely aligned with like the default human values, there is the danger of X risks and S risks, because humans excel at existential risks. Let's face it, we killed most wild animals during the last 70 years. Like in our lifetime, in yours and mine lifetime, we killed probably most wild animals on the face of this planet. And S risks, like effective farming, is one of the most, I think, effective ways of reproducing suffering all over this planet.
Yeah, you almost couldn't design it worse, right? Yes.
Yeah, really.
And I'd love to drill into that. What should the values be that we align to? But the other point you mentioned is the technical alignment question, because there are many who will say, and I interviewed Roman Yampolsky a long while back, but there are others who will say there's no point in thinking about alignment because it is technically impossible. They would, talk to your analogy about the cow and the human and say, look, by definition, these things are more capable than us. We should just give up on the very idea that we could ever align them in any way whatsoever. It's just a fool's errand. So they would suggest either, take our foot off the accelerator and just stop completely, or develop very narrow forms of artificial intelligence that are controllable, that are things like AlphaFold, or, there's a specific domain that they only operate in that. And there's enormous abundance and possibility just in those narrow applications. So let's do that because they might be safer, but we should just give up on the idea of alignment at all. What's your view on that space? Do you think there is a potential to actually influence, align, or maybe even persuade powerful AIs and the super AIs they would go on to create? I mean, clearly you think there's a possibility, right? Otherwise you wouldn't be doing this work. But
I think there is a possibility, but I think also, I mean, when people think about AI regulation, sometimes they address like nuclear regulation, which was very successful to an extent, and we still didn't have like a huge nuclear war, except, I mean, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but since then. So you could see it as a success, but I think they're forgetting that nukes don't have the promise to utopia. AI does have the promise to utopia. That's why it's going to be very hard to stop the acceleration of AI, because it promised us longevity, escape velocity, bringing us to be younger and not dying, and the energy, and like a world full of, if you read like Dario Amodai's posts and Sam Altman's, they're trying to create this vision of like, for example, Dario Amodai, which is the CEO of Anthropic, he says that we could, and I think he's exaggerating, but he says that we can reach scientific progress of between 50 and 100 years in the next 5 to 10 years. And he's talking about like things, which is a bit like the gradients of bliss of David Pierce. I forgot the exact term that he uses for this, but it's enchanting. You have to say when you read it, it's enchanting. And that has a huge risk because it pushes humanity to acceleration. Together, of course, with the fact that the West is in a nuclear arms race with China, and they say that if we don't reach AGI, China is going to reach AGI. But even aside from that, you can think about international treaties, which all the companies, all the countries are pausing AI, are stopping AI, are decelerating. I think that will be very good if we go for that. Whether it will happen, I don't know. But I'm saying just the promise of utopia is something that will make it harder to stop.
So you acknowledge that alignment might be a difficult challenge, but we have to try. We have no choice.
We have no choice. But I mean, I agree that it's hard to think how we can control someone who is much smarter than us. But on the other hand, you can also think about it as education and not control. So think about it as a baby. You know that this baby is going to be a genius, a total genius. You will never be as smart as this baby, but you can still nurture him and you can still teach him morals and you can still influence him to a great deal. And that is what we can do with this baby, with the AI. So even if AI grows to an extent beyond our control, I think it's a spectrum. On the one hand, you have an aligned AI. In the middle, you have coexistence. What a relationship that we have with AI. It's not we are controlling, you are controlling, but we're having sort of a relationship. I think most people are still in the side of alignment. We got to have it totally aligned. I can understand it. I can relate to it. On the other side is misalignment, which I think no one wants, because then you cannot know what will be the result. So if you think about it like from an educational point of view, I think even if we cannot fully control it, we have to try to educate it to the right values.
And the current, as an example, right, the current LLMs, we are influencing them and aligning them in some way, shape, or form. And some people would say we're doing that well, and others would say we're doing it badly. But we are aligning them, right, because of the data sets that they're ingesting that we can filter, right? The default is they're sort of sucking up every public piece of content ever created, and quite a lot of the private stuff as well. But you could, at least at the moment, theoretically, constrain that or shape it in some way or exclude some stuff. And I would argue that, powerful artificial intelligence is ingesting loads of content about how wonderful animal agriculture is probably not a good sign for the future prospects of humanity, as you pointed out. But we're also using things like reinforcement learning as well, where user feedback or expert feedback is also being used to align. People are doing red teaming and other sort of challenges to sort of spot signs of AI is escaping from control or being deceptive, or so there are levers we're using. Is your sense that how we align will just be more of that sort of stuff? But what is the risk that those alignment approaches follow the align with default human ethics stance, which they seem to be doing at the moment, versus something that is more sentiocentric and more broadly compassionate? That's too much of a question, right?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's a big risk and it's something we need to address. And I don't think the default will be aligning AI to some great morality or sentientism or something that cares about all sentient beings. This is why I think we need interventions. We need to create a moral alignment space, a multi-dimensional space. And you already have great organizations working in the space like AI for Animals and Alias AI and other organizations working for animals, working for digital minds, Open Pause, other organizations. It's not going to happen on its own. The human, I think this is the way that I see it. The AI age demands a transformation in human consciousness, in human awareness, in human storytelling. The story of our species need to be rewritten in the AI age. And currently, we're just continuing with a regular trajectory. Business as usual. And we know what business as usual means to non-human animals and non-humans in general.
Yeah, or less powerful sentient beings in general. Yeah, as we may learn. So is that how you tie the imperative of positive AI alignment to the idea of human alignment? Because many people, again, will engage with this topic skeptically. Many people in the animal advocacy movement will look at this and say, look, this AI thing is a distraction, right? We need to focus on the harms that humans are doing today. But I guess part of your point is, well, I agree. We need to do both because, sorry, I should let you answer, right? But part of aligning AIs positively is about realigning humanity positively.
Yeah, first,
how do they relate?
They're nurturing each other. The better values the I have, the more we talk to this friend which has better values, the better values we have, and the better values we have, the better the data and the reinforcement learning and all the other institutional AI and all the other methods that we use to align AI. So it goes both ways, but I think another way to think about it is just as compute or intelligence. Think about the whole intelligence in the world. You have a lot of human intelligence. You have currently not so much, but rising AI intelligence. You want all of this intelligence to be compassionate. You don't want only human intelligence to be as compassionate as possible. And if you see human intelligence, which is like staying like this, and you see AI intelligence, artificial, rising and rising and rising, I like to think about human intelligence as HI and artificial intelligence as AI, just for them not to sound so different. You have HI currently is here. You have AI is accelerating. Should we ignore the AI? I think not, because this intelligence is going to have tremendous effects on our world. And also a way to think about it is compute. You need more and more compute, more and more calculations for the benefit of all sentient beings, whether they're human calculations or machine calculations.
Yeah. So we need to be concerned with AI because its capacity and power and intelligence is accelerating. But at the same time, that AI is also, at least in part, learning from HI. So we need to transform human intelligence to close that compassion and wisdom gap you talked about before. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I think within the AI space, we need to create a strong discussion and technical work and space, which is focused on the ethical question, which is currently very neglected and left outside, because the focus of the AI space is increasing capabilities of AI to some extent, focused on the question of control, keeping the control in human hands. That's why the AI safety space is focused on. But the ethics is left aside, and that's very, very dangerous. Like I said before, humans excel at X risk and S risks. And if we see that the gap between the power of humans and the ethics will keep increasing, we can actually end up in a much worse world than we are today. Much worse. If capabilities go up, but ethics doesn't, morality is not scaling. So we need to rise up to the challenge and rewrite our story as a human species, as human beings, to be the stewards of all the sentient beings on the planet, and not just, some species who is excels at destruction, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Now, the final question before I let you go here is, how does the possibility of sentient artificial intelligence play in here? You've talked about digital minds too. And I guess there's at least two different questions here. One is, okay, well, if artificial intelligences might be sentient, don't they become moral patients in their own right? There's a risk that we could be harming them, or they could harm each other, right? That's a whole new category of moral patients we need to be concerned about. But there's also this question about, how does the potential for artificial intelligence and artificial sentience play into the risk and abundance opportunities? Would a sentient artificial intelligence be more likely to adopt sentientism because they're a sentient being, whereas they're probably going to reject humanism or, other anthropocentric stances because they're not human? So yeah, again, too much of a question, but a general thought about digital minds as moral patients, but also, would a sentient artificial intelligence be more or less moral, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question, which is not being researched enough. First, I want to say that about the question of can digital minds, can something which is not the substrate of biology be a moral patient? I would say, of course they can, if they exist, if they have subjective experiences. And if you think about the world as subjective experiences, you remember that these terms that we create, which are not real, humans, rabbits, digital minds, babies, it's words that we created, but actually there is the subjective experience, right? There isn't a species, there is a subjective experience. So I think if you look at it this way, some of those words lose some of their meanings. So if I tell you, for example, that a chimpanzee feels exactly like some 4-year-old, let's say it's not true, but let's say it is. What's the difference between, why do you call one a chimpanzee and one a human being? And you're sure they're very, very different from each other. But actually, if you look at the subjective experience at what's real, what exists, maybe they're not that different. So looking at it from this perspective, there's almost no question. If there is subjective experiences, of course, digital minds are moral patients, and we should pay much attention to their morality. And even more so, I think, because they can be copied very easily, and that's also dangerous. So if they are enslaved, if they are suffering, and they are copied in massive numbers in a much faster and more like efficient way than the non-efficient way that humans copy each other through birth, that can be very dangerous, of course.
Yeah. And just to throw in this point, there are people, and I've interviewed some of them, who would say, in principle, artificial intelligences can't be sentient because they think there's something about the analog nature of biological physics that, cannot be replicated in a digital context. Although, again, I'm not sure that's a really in principle objection, because whatever analog thing you have, I think you can probably still build that in some form of computation. But people will talk about that. They will also talk about the nature of embodiment as being somehow important to framing subjective experience. But again, to my mind, embodiment is really just, different patterns of inputs and outputs, right? There's motor actuations going out to bits of my body that I assume are out there. I don't know. And there are senses coming in. Are they coming in from something else? I don't know. So I don't see embodiment as really that distinct, right? Because in a way, I am creating artificial simulation in my own mind of things I think are out there, right? But having said that, I did want to drop in that there are people who, in principle, think it's just not possible. Even with them, I would say, well, how sure are you? Because even if you're only 95% sure, and given what you talked about the potential numbers of these digital minds, we should at least be aware of that potential risk, right? In the same way as I might have, a low credence in the sentience of a very, very simple invertebrate animal, but I'd still give it some credence, right? I wouldn't completely disregard them. So anyway, I wanted to throw that in.
Especially if it's not a particular vertebrate, but this vertebrate is constantly changing and creating another invertebrate and another invertebrate. I think that the thing is, when you get to the core of it, first, you're right. Some experts and very serious people, which I admire, like David Pierce, think that digital minds will not be sentient. But then again, the question is, are we looking at current LLMs, or are we thinking about an AI which will create an AI, which will create another AI, which will create another AI? Is there something in carbon, in the number of proton atoms, that makes biology sentient and not sentient? By the way, who's to say that the sixth ASI down the line will not create the next AI with a biological substrate? I don't know. Maybe it will use that substrate. I think if sentience is to be used and as a tool, if it will be important for this artificial mind that will create the next artificial mind, perhaps it will figure out the basis of sentience and will be able to plug it into the this artificial mind. I don't think there is anything particular in biology which makes us sentient and digital minds not sentient. And if there is, like maybe it's quantum calculations, or maybe it's the complexity, the huge complexity of the human body, which is for sure much more complex than any AI. Even insects are much more complex, I think, than any AI currently. All of that can be replicated in AIs. So while, of course, I respect...
If we're confident now, fine, but how confident would we be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Yeah,
exactly. So I don't think we can take the chance, though I admit there are experts, which of course know much more than me about this, who say that, but then again, there are many experts who also think it's possible that they would be sentient. And I would say even some people are not 100% sure that you can cancel any sentience with the current models. Still, the consensus view is they are not sentient, but some scholars say I'm not that sure about it 100%. And I think it's a fascinating question. Should we deliberately make AI sentient in order for it to understand morality inherently? Because from my perspective, if AI is not sentient, the fact that it reads in the data that humans are saying suffering is bad and happiness is good, it's just like saying humans like red, they don't like green. It doesn't have any inherent value. It doesn't have any it's just a piece of data. But if he has subjective experiences, the AI, he can know that suffering is bad. On the other hand, it also creates a great risk because, as we said, they can be copied and then suffering could be multiplied. So I think one of the most urgent questions for us as a movement that strives to create morally aligned AI is to investigate and research this particular question. Should we strive for AI to be sentient or not? And I think it's a very difficult question that I don't have a good answer to.
So your sense is that a sentient AI would be more likely to be moral because they will, as you and I do, have that visceral sense, of what it is to experience. But the risk in allowing them to be created is that they are moral patients in their own right. And until we know more about what it's like to be them and what it is to suffer and flourish, then there's a risk in there too. Yeah.
Yeah. I would ask you, what brought you into sentientism? Was because, as I said, for me, one of the experiences was feeling deep suffering, hard suffering when I was harsh suffering when I was very, very sick. The sickest I was in my life in India. I had food poisoning. With your experience, was there something specific that made you follow sentientism?
There wasn't a specific moment, but it was more a dawning realization, and I think it probably did really deep down start off with my own experience, right? That's quite often how I'll explain it. Is, look, here's a moral journey we can go through. I know whatever sentience is, I am experiencing things now, even if it's an illusion, right? Whatever it is, I'm experiencing this thing right now. It is absolutely salient to me, right? So if I pinch my hand, that hurts. If I have an enjoyable conversation like this one, I will be happy, right? Those things matter to me. So in a way, you start from quite a self-centered point of view, but then based on evidence and reasoning, you recognize that there are probably other sentient beings out there. And over time, you come to realize, how broadly distributed they are across the evolutionary tree and non-human animals and so on and so forth, and maybe even digital minds. But although it starts from that quite, if you like, selfish, subjective inside my own head place, the broadening realization is that capacity for sentience is not, it's not a human thing, and it existed for hundreds of millions of years, probably before humans even came into being. And humans today are a vanishingly tiny percentage of all the maybe, sextillions of sentient beings just on this planet. And maybe there are others too. So there is a risk that, it embeds that sort of anthropocentric, selfish starting point. But actually, if you take it through a naturalistic epistemology, leads you to a very humble view of, yes, my subjective experience is all that I can experience, but there are probably countless sextillions of others out there that also matter too, if I want to call myself moral. So that, I think that's the sort of pattern. It is starting from that, in my own head view, but ending up with something that is mind-blowingly expansive.
Yeah, so there is the side of rationality, of intelligence that we need, but as you said, there is also the side of just having those experiences and deeply understanding that suffering is bad and following a path of morality from
Yeah,
there.
I mean, and the thought experiment is if I was a being that, you know, was not sentient or didn't value my experiences in any way, right? So if someone threatened to torture me to death now, and I genuinely didn't mind, you know, I really was totally indifferent either way. I just didn't care, right? So either I was in some sense aware of that choice, but didn't value any of those states at all, genuinely didn't value them, or I wasn't having any experiences at all. So I really wouldn't mind at all. Would I be capable of being moral, right, without that intrinsic sense? I don't know. It's a difficult question to answer. I think you could do it in a maybe a technical sense, because maybe here's another tangent. You know, there are lots of people I've interviewed and met who do come to this sentientist or sentiocentric stance through an emotional lens, right? They feel compassion, they feel empathy, they imagine what it's like to be another, and it's quite a visceral. But there are others who don't really feel that so much, and they are more, you know, they're like, you know, I can see animals suffering and it doesn't actually bother me that much, but intellectually, you know, and logically, and I want to be consistent and coherent, you know, I know that matters. They found a more intellectual path to it. So I wonder even if a non-sentient artificial intelligence could find that more sort of intellectual, spreadsheety sort of way to being
I'm not
compassionate,
sure
even if
because
they don't feel it. I don't know.
yeah, I think even those people, and I'm one of them, I could say maybe because, you know, working in slaughterhouses and places like that, you
That's
get
how you
insensitive.
survived there. That's how you managed to do it.
Yeah. But if I was very sensitive, I wouldn't have gone to work in a place like that. But I think that even for those people who it's more rational, and I think I'm one of them, at the beginning, there was some feeling when they saw something that bothered them, they did like a small simulation within their bodies, how it's like to be this other person. And they felt bad just for a second. And I think another way to look at it is just if AI is not sentient, we're excluding the most critical information, just knowledge from this AI to understand morality. We're just excluding it and we're expecting it to understand something. So I'm very worried about that. I'm very worried about intelligence, super intelligence, which is not sentient.
And that's a really important point, because you're almost saying that they could have a sort of technical bookish understanding of sentience through reading everything and digesting everything that humans have ever created or said. But without feeling it themselves, there's a knowledge gap. There's an epistemological gap. There's something they don't know. They don't know what it's like to feel and what it's like to be, right? So, and that's a worry for you. Yeah.
They say about like blind people, how can you explain to them what is to see, even if you try to, you know, tell them something. But here, having subjective experiences is all the senses. It's not only seeing, it's hearing, it's feeling sensations, it's everything. So it's very hard for me to understand how can you understand morality without being sentient.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I've taken so much of your time. I could talk to you all day, but I really should let you go. But that's been absolutely fascinating, because I think you've laid out, you know, you've had a history and a career of trying to make the world better for non-human animals as well as human animals. You see the advent of powerful artificial intelligence, whether it's sentient or not, as a critical point for us that drives both an imperative to change the way humanity is as well as give us a chance of aligning artificial intelligence so it can actually be deeply moral and operate to take us down that abundance route rather than the risk and destruction route. So that's been absolutely fascinating journey. Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation before I let you go? But also, how can people follow you, support your work with the Moral Alignment Center, keep up to date with your thinking? What's the best way of people staying in touch?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll talk a bit about the Moral Alignment Center, which is an organization I'm starting, which is focused on community building in order to strengthen the space of people working to put the ethical question in the forefront. And there are a lot of different interventions that we need in order to reach this stage of moral alignment, AI morally aligned with the right values, the right ethics. It includes technical work. How do you practically get this AI to be aligned? For example, you change some of the core data that is fed into the AI. That's one example. There are many other technical options. By the way, one option that I think should be investigated is to change language, because as I told you, I think that human language is not very compassionate, or it could be much more compassionate. And the reason why I think it's not very compassionate is because it's very much focused on the objectives, at least the way that we use language. It's focused on the objective and not the subjective experiences. But we have a lot of biological tendencies, which Noam Chomsky and others talked about, to develop a certain structure of language, evolutionary tendencies. AI doesn't have those tendencies. It's not a biological being. So AI can actually develop its own language, which will be much more compassionate, much more in tune, not with survival, not with communication, not with other things that were optimized in the evolutionary path, but with morality, with clarity, with truthfulness, and things like that. So I don't think, looking a bit longer in the long run, I don't think AI should be limited only to human language. And by the way, also now they're trying to decode animal language or animal communication and feed that into the AI, which I think is great. AI starts to see other perspectives, not only human perspectives. So the Moral Alignment Center, we focus on community and field building. So I think the first thing we do now in these days is create content to establish the field. What are the main concepts in this field? What is moral alignment? How is it needed? How does it interact with other fields which are adjacent to it and we want to collaborate with, like AI safety, like effective altruism, like other advocacy for humans, for animals, for AI safety, of course, and control, and all of that. So this is field building. Coordinating action, we're thinking about starting some sort of ethical pledge within the AI space of people who say, we will work for AI to be a positive force for all sentient beings, not only humans. Currently, by the way, if you look at all the top companies building AI, if you go to their websites, their stated goal is only for humanity. They don't mention anything other than that. And I think that's very dangerous. We need a new story as humanity. We got to have a new story. We need to be the stewards.
And quite often when challenged, they will say, oh, no, of course we mean
yes,
all sentient beings. But it's the anthropocentrism, whether it's explicit or unthinking, is all pervasive, right? As it is in most human culture, right? And as you've made very clear, this is another space where we cannot allow that to be the default.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's incredible that the people in AI leadership positions are actually, they care a lot about animals. For example, Sam Altman is an ideological vegetarian, and other people. And like I said, just working with AI, it makes you think a lot about animals. It's very natural because you're creating a higher intelligence. So it makes you think how you treat lower intelligences. By the way, we haven't talked about it, but I think also having a sentient-centric AI, and we need to define what it is. I think one of the missing work is just to define, how does a sentient-centric AI behave? How does it gradually change society, working with humans, uplifting humans, helping everybody to flourish, not on the expense of each other? That's, I think, an important philosophical work. We talked about field building. We talked about coordination action like this pledge. Public awareness campaigns, I think, are also very important and currently missing. PR, opinion columns, a lot of written materials on why this is one of the most urgent and needed interventions in our world currently, working to create a moral aligned AI. And funding, much more. We think about starting the Moral Alignment Fund, which will fund many different interventions in this small but growing space. It's very much underfunded. By the way, the whole AI safety space is very much underfunded. I think the whole philanthropical funds of all AI safety can be something like a big Hollywood movie. I'm not exaggerating. It's something like that. Like if you look at the, I don't know, if you look at the last Joaquin Phoenix movie, Joker 2, which is not considered very good, I think it's maybe $300 or $400 million. And that's about the size of the farmed animal rights movement budget annually, right? 300, 400 million. And AI safety is maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more, depends on the calculations, if we're talking about philanthropical funds. So it's still very neglected.
Yeah, if you go back to the analogy earlier on, if you look at the billions of dollars that are pressing down on the accelerator versus the few hundred million that are working on the steering and the brake. Yeah.
Exactly. It's all full gas on the speed and the acceleration. So that is generally what we do. And I'm looking for volunteers. We already have a few volunteers that help with content creation. I'm looking for collaborators, for a co-founder, and anyone who wants to help us or wants us to connect them with other organizations in this space for animals, for digital minds, for humans, is welcome to connect me. You can find me on my LinkedIn. Just search for Ronen Bar on LinkedIn. Also, we have the Moral Alignment Center LinkedIn. Just search for Moral Alignment Center. And if someone wants to read more about my thoughts, he can search me in the EA forum and read my thoughts on Vipassana, on animal stuff, on AI, of course, and other things. And that's it generally. And I'm very open to hear any feedback because it's the beginning. We're open to change our minds about certain stuff and about all stuff, I might even say. So feel free to reach out and give any constructive feedback.
That's great. Well, thank you. It's been fascinating to talk to you. I could go on for hours, and more power to you. I've been thinking a lot about trying to make humanity sentientist, but I think it's also deeply important to make sure that powerful AIs are sentientist too. And although we've talked a lot about the ethical side of that, sentiocentric compassion, the epistemology is important too, right? We already see the problems of AIs fabricating or believing things that are untrue, right? So I can imagine an alternative future where we have a compassionate artificial intelligence that misunderstands reality and still does terrible things, just as we can have humans who are compassionate, who are wrong about the world and do terrible things. So yeah, that's why I think, evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings might be a decent baseline for both powerful AI and future humanity. But let's see. But thank you so much for your work on that front. It's been a real pleasure having you as a guest on Sentientism, and please stay in touch. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how the field builds and the community builds around the Moral Alignment Center. Thank you, Ronen.
Thank you for all your work. Thanks a lot.
Take care.